In this recording, we will be going over the history of special education. Please know that this is a very brief overview, kind of a Reader's Digest view. Special education is specially designed instruction that meets the needs of an exceptional student. Special education is not a place. It is the services and instruction that may take place in a variety of different places. Special education can take many different forms. It can refer to the special materials or structured educational environments, instruction that the student might require. It can be specialized teaching techniques, specialized equipment and/or facilities, and related services. Related services includes things like speech and language services, occupational therapy, physical therapy. It could be counseling. It could be outside services like rehabilitation, anything that the student needs and that is a part of the IEP that doesn't fall under typical academic subjects. Prevalence refers to the percentage of a population or the number of people having a particular exceptionality. According to the book, 8.7% of students, or over 6.7 million students in the United States, receive special education services. If you look at other resources, they might have a slightly different percentage of prevalence. Frequently, you will hear people refer to the prevalence of special education students as 10% of the population. Most of these students are between the ages of 6 and 21, and I would actually say most of them are between the ages of 6 and 18 or 19. There are some students, because of their disability, that are able to continue receiving special education services through the age of 21. They would not graduate. They would stay at the high school and do additional work, usually on transition goals. And we'll talk more about transition goals later. Also, there are students that go on an IEP as young as the age of 3. So actually there are students on IEPs ranging from the ages of 3 to 21. But the majority of them are in the K-12 schools. There are high incidence and low incidence disabilities, and that basically means what it sounds like. There are some disabilities that occur more frequently than others. And we will be talking about both high incidence and low incidence disabilities in this course. This is a normal curve, otherwise known as a bell curve, and it shows the hypothetical distribution of students. You will notice the two middle sections, the light tan, go from 1 standard deviation below to 1 standard deviation above the mean. That's a little over 68% of the students fall into that area, and that is usually considered the normal range. When you get outside of that range, then you are talking about students who are going to be struggling more. If they are on the left-hand side as you're looking at this, if they're on the right-hand side, that means they probably are going to be doing well, or at least they have a higher IQ. You notice the IQ scores that correspond are in that beige strip along the bottom. Students who receive special education are the ones that fall to the far left, typically. The Originally, you needed to be at least 2 standard deviations below the mean in order to receive special education services. Now, some of your students that have learning disabilities or some of the other things, possibly autism, might fall into that section that is labeled as 13.59%. They are students that would have a normal IQ or a near normal IQ, but have other disabilities that qualify them for special education services. So very early on in 1500 BC to 1700 AD, people with disabilities were thought to be possessed by the devil. They were sinners. They were being punished for the sins, either their sins or the sins of their parents. Um, Frequently, their treatments included torture, some kind of punishment. They might have been killed at birth or even burned at the stake. In many of our third world countries, these same beliefs are still in play. Sometimes the disabled were used as entertainment and they were laughed at. Frequently, they were forced to beg on the streets. And then in 1700 AD, the first special school for individuals with specific disabilities was established in Europe, and it was for the deaf or the blind. In the early 20th century, education became compulsory for the majority of the population, but not for the students with disabilities. Those students were excluded from schooling. If they were placed in school, they were placed in ungraded classes, and it was more of a holding tank than it was a school. It was during this time that IQ testing emerged, and the scientific view at that time was that hereditary determined the intelligence. There was a movement to force sterilization of many of the individuals with disabilities. They were seen as a burden on society and that they were diluting the superior gene pool. So most of them were placed in institutions or they were kept at home by the parents, but they were not in school. Disabilities were not looked on as acceptable. Even President Roosevelt's physical disability was hidden from view of the population as a whole. So most of the disabled students were living at home. Their families weren't receiving help from anybody, and they were frequently struggling to get the basic needs of these children met. And then in the 1950s, some of the parents started to organize. And then shortly after that, professional organizations started to come into existence. And slowly, parents started suing to get services for their students within their own communities. So they were very isolated pockets of movement going on. So in the mid 20th century, one of the questions became separate but equal. There was a belief that students of color should be educated in separate settings. And then the question became, can those separate settings be equal? And in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, stated that separate cannot be equal. And here's a quote from Chief Justice Earl Warren. Notice that this took place in 1954. At this point in time, though, they were not talking about students with disabilities. They were talking about students who were excluded or being educated separately because of their race. So in the late 50s to mid 60s, the civil rights movement was going on. And many of the disabled people were also a part of these civil rights movements. In fact, there was a crawl-in. In other places, they were talking about sit-ins. Here they had a crawl-in, and physically disabled students crawled up the steps of the Capitol building. The goal was justice for all. So civil rights played a very big part eventually in getting students with disabilities the rights that they deserved. But initially in the 60s, these rights were only given to the minority students by race, not because of disabilities. But there are many that still believe that disability rights are civil rights. In fact, it is the Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, that is responsible for eliminating discrimination on the basis of disability. And OCR receives multiple complaints and inquiries in the area of elementary and secondary education involving Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. You will notice as we talk about the history of special education that there is a lot of litigation involved. Most of the changes that have come about because of changes in the law, and many of them still bear the names of those laws. Here are some of the landmark legal cases. We've already spoken a little bit about Brown versus Board of Education, and that talked about no child being excluded from school. It wasn't until 1972 that we started seeing cases granting students with disabilities rights, or extending the right to special education to those children. Those students with disabilities that were part of the civil rights movement were still not covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I keep coming back to that because that's a very important part. What you need to do now is stop this video and watch a short video about Willowbrook. This happened in 1972. And remember, we had the ruling from the Supreme Court back in 1954, but almost 20 years later, this was still the conditions under which many of the students with disabilities were living. It's rather disturbing to watch, but do the best you can. In 1975, PL 94-142, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, finally gave access to education to the students with disabilities. We continue to improve on that throughout IDEA in 1990. Then IDEA was reauthorized in 2004. The American with Disabilities Act that was passed in 1990 ensures the right to non-discriminatory treatment in other aspects of life. It's a civil rights law again. Those students who are outside the K-12 system are covered by ADA. So that would include students that are coming to college. And it also includes things like the rights of the disabled at work. It covers access into a building, the cutouts that we have on the curbs, those types of things. IDEA deals with the K-12 system, and the rest of the world basically is covered by ADA. Then when the No Child Left Behind Act came along, it really put an emphasis on standards-based, and for the first time, the same standards that had been applied for other students were now applied to the students with special education. So that was a huge change. So here's just an overview of the changes that have happened in special education law. As we mentioned initially, it was just pockets, individuals, and small groups working on different efforts. The big one, the big breakthrough for the students with disabilities was in 1974. Then the IDEA in 1990, reauthorized in 1997, and again in 2004. Now, the other thing that is important to see here is initially what we were looking at were issues of access, just getting the students into the school. And the more recent legislation is looking at the quality of instruction that those students are receiving once they are in the schools. So initially it was just getting our foot in the door, and now it's more about making sure that the instruction everybody is receiving is of high quality. So IDEA addressed special education and related services, said that they should be designed to meet the unique learning needs of the eligible children with disabilities preschool through age 21. So actually, we talked earlier about IEPs being age 3 up to the age of 21. There is also access now for students as soon as at birth if there are certain disabilities recognized. The students from birth up to age 3 are are covered by a different section of the law, and what they have is actually a family plan, because it is looking more at how the family is interacting, or the caretakers are interacting with that student, and it's about educating them and helping them to maximize the stimulation that the student receives. The other thing that IDEA talks about is transition, that students with disabilities need to be prepared for their future in education, employment, and independent living. Another way we talk about that is in living, learning, and work. IDEA was the most recent legislation, and it has a lot of principles that made a big difference for the students with disabilities. One of those is zero reject. It was not at all uncommon before for students with disabilities, even if they were in the schools, to not take the standardized tests. They might be encouraged to stay home on those days so that they wouldn't bring down the school's average scores. Also, there were many students who were rejected by schools because they thought that their disability was too severe, and that no longer can happen. In fact, the schools have a responsibility to locate, identify, and provide services to all eligible students. Protection and evaluation. We are required by law to conduct an assessment to determine if the student has a disability and if they need educational services, special education services. You will hear the term FAPE frequently. FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. All students are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Appropriate is the term that is interpreted differently by different people. But generally speaking, everybody is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Another term you will hear a lot about is least restrictive environment, or LRE. That means that the student is to be educated with non-disabled peers whenever possible, or to the maximum extent possible. Now, that doesn't mean that all students with disabilities should be in a general education classroom all the time. There are times that that's not going to provide them enough support, and there are times that they might be disruptive to the other students. But the school is charged with finding the maximum extent appropriate. So you will hear quite a bit about both FAPE and LRE. Another thing is that the schools have the responsibility to educate the parents of their rights, and there's very specific procedures that are set up, and the schools are required to follow those. The parents are a very large part of planning their child's IEP and also the delivery of the instruction. Nothing can happen without parental permission, not even testing. So in summary, the focus of IDEA, the most recent revision of that, was to increase the academic achievement of students in special education. And one of the ways we do that is focus on writing measurable goals, and they need to be meaningful, and we're actually going to measure each of them. And one of the ways we measure them is through progress monitoring. Also included was increasing accountability for results, that it's no longer acceptable for these students just to be like in holding cells, that the expectation is that they are going to be making progress. And also IDEA 2004 made an attempt to streamline the special education process. You notice that I have highlighted the part about writing measurable goals and progress monitoring. And that is because the IEP project that you will be doing throughout the course, throughout this course, is focusing on those parts of the IEP process. Here are some of the requirements of special education. If a student is found to be eligible for special education, each year the school is required to hold an annual meeting where they look at the data and evaluate the progress that the student is making. If there is a need to meet before that, you don't have to wait for the annual meeting. You can call the team together and address whatever the issue is at that point in time. But at the very least, you are required to meet annually to go over the student's progress, based on the data that is available. Also, every 3 years, you do a more intensive evaluation, much like an initial evaluation, and reestablish that the student continues to need special education services. The law also requires that we address transition needs of the student. We're required at the age of 3 to move the student onto an IEP. That's considered a transition from preschool into the IEP. Moving the student from the family plan to the IEP. And then as the student moves to kindergarten, that's another big transition in their life. And another meeting is required to be held to make sure that the services are in place that will be needed to support that child's growth. And then what we typically think about as transition meetings are required by federal law to happen during the year in which the student turns 16. In Iowa, that meeting is required at the year in which they turn 14. And specifically what needs to be addressed at that time are the living, learning, and working goals. Living, learning, and working goals, or transition goals, become the focus of the IEP from the age of 14 in Iowa, 16 by federal law, until the student graduates or until the age of 21. Also required is the involvement of the parents. The parents' permission is needed before you can do any initial evaluation. Also, the parents have to agree to having the student receive special education services, and any major changes that are made in the student's programming must include the parents. When the student becomes 18 years old, they get to make those decisions, but up until that time, the parents need to be involved. Now you will stop this video and you will watch a video of the 35th anniversary of IDEA, which is an overview of the history of special education. They're going to tell you more eloquently what I just told you. It takes a little less than 9 minutes to watch it, so happy viewing.